Nazis. Claims that Russian agents are stirring up unrest on the ground are absurd. We're used to hearing things like that, but it's nonsense. The only new people with Russian passports here are the journalists. And just to remind you, not a single Russian official has come here to speak in front of the crowds.
Get some up-to-the-minute comments. We're joined now by modern history expert Mark Ullman joining us live. Hi, Mark. People in Slovansk have been saying they're bracing for larger-scale offensives, maybe even as early as this evening. Kiev's pledged a harsh crackdown. How violent could it get?
Well, it could get very violent, but I think part of what is a little bit surprising is that the Ministry of the Interior talks about sending in special forces, presumably highly trained commandos, yet what we seem to be seeing is a rather ramshackle operation on the edge of Slavyansk by people who might be called paramilitary militias, certainly people who don't seem to have the high level of training or commitment that we would expect from somebody who wanted to move in very quickly and decisively to crush what they see as a rebellion. So the danger is, in one level, that we are going to see sporadic fighting rather than some decisive action. Now that might seem to be less worrying, but on the other hand it does suggest that you could have a drip of casualties through the night and of course further radicalization, which we've seen going on both in southeast Ukraine but also in other places where Ukrainian nationalists are being aroused by the arguments that their country is about to be dissected.
And what about this tit-for-tat argument that anti-government activists are saying on one hand they're being attacked by fighters from the right sector? That's being denied in Kiev. How much of it is true, do you think?
Well, I think we've certainly heard the rhetoric from the right sector, but also, after all, the new government in Kiev announced it was setting up a National Guard precisely in order to incorporate the paramilitary fighters of the right sector into something that would look more like a state organization. And given the failure of the local police in the south and east of Ukraine to assert the authority of the new regime in Kiev, they really do need if you like, committed activists, and those are more likely to come actually from outside the old security forces. We've seen, for instance, the dismissal of large numbers, tens of thousands of policemen and Berkut members for supporting or maintaining the government stance under Yanukovych. Those people, I suspect, are providing at least some of the activists now in the southeast, so that the new regime in Kiev is rather short of trained and competent personnel. And at the same time, it has an incentive to move the radical right-wing militias out of Kiev, sending them somewhere where, if they're successful, the new government can claim the credit. If they get a bloody nose from confrontation with people in southeast Ukraine, it will in fact weaken them vis-a-vis the other side of the new regime, which came to power on the back, if you like, of their violence in February, but is not entirely comfortable with them.
I mean, from the beginning, as I was just saying, of this popular uprising in the east, people have been saying that it is their fear of the neo-Nazis, and Kiev and Western states have been saying there is no such threat. Will the southeast, the east, be listened to now? They're genuine concerns. They say they're genuine concerns. It's what's sparked this off.
Well, this is a great problem. If even a week ago the new regime in Kiev had said, why don't we hold a referendum simultaneous with the presidential elections that they've scheduled for the 25th of May, why don't we offer a palette of reforms, maybe they could have calmed the fears. But what they've tended to say is, we're listening to you, but anybody who you choose as your spokesman is a Russian agent, an agent of a foreign power, an imperialist threat. So there isn't really any dialogue, and we saw that on Friday when Mr. Yatsenyuk, the interim Prime Minister, went to Donetsk. He basically spoke to a hall of his own supporters and the local oligarchs, rather than trying to address the local people, or at least those people who are demonstrating against his government. And I think this is the great problem. It's a dialogue of the deaf, at best.
How's this going to be covered, especially what's happened today in the media in the West?
Well, what is, I think, quite striking is that there are several journalists from Western media outlets in Slavyansk, and they all contradict the official line from Kiev. They say there isn't an actual operation in the town. There is some kind of disturbance. There's been some sound of shooting on the edges of the town, but nothing that one could call a serious military or commando operation. And so maybe something more is going to come tonight, but maybe this is a sign that the new regime in Kiev is not really able to assert itself, and even journalists who in the past have been rather sympathetic to its point of view, having to say that they don't find the information that they're getting from official sources in Kiev matching what they are themselves seeing in Slavyansk and other parts of southeast Ukraine.
A final quick thought, the American angle here. John Kerry's apparently in a phone conversation with Foreign Minister Lavrov once again pointed the finger at Russia. How long is this blame game likely to go on, do you think?
Well, I think it's quite a big blame game. One problem for the Americans is that they're really boxing in the dark. They didn't expect what would happen in Crimea to happen. They don't really know what's happening in southeast Ukraine. They don't really know what's happening in Russia itself. And so, in a sense, they're now stirring up a great deal of anxiety, partly in a sense to cover themselves against some worst-case scenario from their point of view. But I think the danger from the point of view of NATO and the Americans is that really they seem to be facing a kind of intelligence black hole in the last few months over the Ukraine and over what's happening there. And I think this is really something that's bewildering them and leading, if you like, to a more shrill response, because they don't really feel able to judge the events clearly and to know what's going to happen next.
Modern historian Mark Almond on the line from Oxford, UK there tonight. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. Violence flaring once again in Ukraine today, with reports of at least 2 deaths and several injuries during fierce gun battles in the country. People have been told to stay indoors and away from all windows while special forces clear Russian separatists from a number of official buildings. Protesters are also said to have seized control of a mayoral office. Well, the operation is taking place in Slavyansk, which is about 90 miles from the Russian border. Armed men seized control of the police headquarters yesterday. Pro-Russian militants also occupied the police headquarters in nearby Kramatorsk yesterday. Well, the NATO Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said, "I'm extremely concerned about the further escalation of tension in eastern Ukraine. The reappearance of men with specialised Russian weapons and identical uniforms without insignia, as previously worn by Russian troops during Russia's illegal and illegitimate seizure of Crimea, is a grave development. I call on Russia to de-escalate the crisis and pull back its large numbers of troops, including special forces from the area around Ukraine's border. Any further Russian military interference under any pretext will only deepen Russia's international isolation." Let's get some analysis on this now, perhaps another point of view. The former advisor to the Kremlin, Alexander Nekrasov, is with us in our central London studio. Good to speak to you, Alexander. Looking at your Twitter feed, as we frequently do here at Sky News, I noticed on one of them you're saying idiots calling themselves experts are saying that Russia is inflaming tensions in eastern Ukraine, which makes no sense at all.
Sense, because we hear a lot of Western politicians and generals, NATO generals, saying that Russia is directly involved in inflating the tension in eastern Ukraine. Why would it do that? Why would Russia need a country in total disarray on its border? This is potentially very dangerous for Russia itself. So I think that the situation is out of control at the moment, simply because the local population in the eastern part of Ukraine, and by the way, there are several more cities which have fallen under their control, Mariupol and others, they have decided to take matters in their own hand, because the central government in Kiev, the interim regime, does not really do anything, does not really answer any of their questions, does not really negotiate with them. Not forgetting, by the way, that the so-called unity government, in inverted commas, in Kiev is not actually a unity government and does not reflect the interests of the East.
Do you think Russia had a hand in what happened in Crimea?
Well, Russia was present there anyway, because there was a large military contingent of 25,000 troops. Obviously they were there, and obviously there were troops outside the base to try to prevent any bloodshed. And let's face it, okay, there were 2 people killed, but that's not a lot compared to this whole massive territory. Of course they were present there, but that's a good thing, because otherwise there would have been the same situation as in the east of Ukraine.
And do you think they were taking orders from the Kremlin?
No. The people in the eastern of Ukraine, this is their... by the way, this is the worst scenario for the Kremlin. And Putin, I think, is not at all happy with what's going on, because he's afraid of Russia being sucked into this situation. And that is why Foreign Minister Lavrov warned the government in Kiev not to use military force against these people in eastern Ukraine, because the situation might just deteriorate to an extent where there would be some sort of volunteers crossing the border into Ukraine. And that would be a total mess, total crisis.
But doesn't it demonstrate his military might and indeed his political largesse if he can do this? Are you saying that what the US is interpreting by this, and indeed the NATO Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, are wrong?
Well, of course they are wrong, because first of all, let's face it, the situation deteriorated after that coup in Kiev. and the legitimate regime was ousted by basically armed men. So, of course, that was the start of the whole process. And you can ask yourself this: would there have been a referendum in Crimea if there was no legitimate fall of the regime in Kiev? Of course not. We would not have seen this situation at all. But now that we are in a crisis which is quickly escalating, I think the only way out is for the interim regime to first of all say there will be no elections in May, because this is laughable. You can't hold an election when you have makings of a civil war across the country. And then talk to the eastern parts, to their representatives about autonomy. This will de-escalate the crisis dramatically. But if they just go on, continue hoping that this election in May will change anything, I don't think it will change anything at all.
Just lastly, Alexander, going back to what's happening today in eastern Ukraine and how to take control of that situation, what's the best thing, in your opinion, for the West to do now on this?
Well, the West should tone down its aggressive rhetoric for first of all. Secondly, now these visits of the CIA director to Kiev, then Joe Biden is going to travel on the 22nd. You know, on the one hand, they're trying to show the Americans that they're supporting Ukraine. On the other hand, that creates even more tension. The moment news appeared that the CIA director was in Kiev, immediately there was a response in all those eastern cities where the people were saying, aha, the Americans are planning an invasion themselves. So everybody has to take a step backwards and just be calm. Otherwise, this will get even worse.
Alexander Nekrasov, thank you.